PrimeTime Budget Special. I'm joined now by Dr. Mary Murphy, lecturer in Politics and Society at Maynooth University, and by Karl Deeter, financial analyst at Irish Mortgage Brokers. Mary Murphy, government claims this was a housing budget, was it?
I think it's quite worrying in terms of the general direction that's signalled for the budget. I think there's two things going on. One is that for whatever reasons, and I think some of the reasons are ideological and some of them are practical, government seems very, very orientated towards market-based solutions to housing rather than building public houses on public land. And I think all the analysis shows, the government's own analysis shows from their own evaluation and economic service, that HAP is not delivering value for money in the longer term. But a lot of the sociological analysis shows that neither is HAP delivering any kind of security of tenure or a decent housing income for people. So some of that maybe is about ideology. It's about a strong belief that market forces are the best way to deliver on this. But I think some of the more practical thing that's going on here that worries me is that for some reason government seems very fixated against the idea of using public land to develop large-scale public housing, the kind of big bang that people might have expected in a budget like this, if it really was to get to grips with the housing problem. We don't see that, and the reasons we don't see that seems to be that deep down there seems to be some acceptance, some common sense has emerged that we cannot build large-scale public housing estates in Ireland, when in fact a lot of the evidence shows that public housing, large-scale public housing worked very well in our past. It's worked very well internationally.
In some places.
There are examples where it worked badly and they've been evaluated, and there are lessons as to how to get the services right, how to get the management right, and how to get the design and the mix right. But from Sweden to Denmark to Austria, we know that countries that have got their housing markets right have given the state quite a big role in those housing markets, not only in relation to social housing, but also in relation to cost rental and affordable housing. And that really worries me. There's no signal in this budget that there's any change of track, and really we seem to be going further up a cul-de-sac that's not going to deliver long-term solutions.
OK, Karl Deeter, if you're looking at a massive market failure, and I don't think anybody would disagree that we're looking at that at the moment, surely the only solution is to get the state to take a hand and to build houses.
Well, what you've done is become part of what I call the intellectual monoculture, where that's the only possible answer. And I understand that obviously it's budget day, so everyone from the grievance industry comes out and says how bad everything is. We're actually doing a good job. But before we start to talk about spending billions, housing has started to get built.
Like, there's 10,000 people homeless.
Well, that's a good figure, and I'll tell you why. Because I have some new statistics there. That's just two local authorities in Dublin, Dún Laoghaire and Dublin City Council. And Fingal. In Fingal, there's 333 three-bed homes with only one person in them. There's 22 four-bed homes with only one person in them. In Dún Laoghaire, which is the richest postcode in this country, there's a five-bed house with one person in them. Now, these are all council-owned homes. There's 10,000 empty beds across all of Dublin, 10,000 empty bedrooms, and we won't ever have a conversation about better use of what we already have. Instead, we'll throw billions at the problem because, God forbid, we put someone's nose out of joint.
OK, so how are we going to get the other four bedrooms in that five-bedroom house?
If this is an emergency, we've got to treat it like one. Like, the trade-off is, would you like to have a family of four living in a single hotel room, or would you like to have a conversation with a person who is under-occupying a state-owned home? Because social housing, as far as I'm concerned, it is societal. I feel I have a stake in that, as does everyone. That's why it's called social housing. The tenant isn't the owner, the state is. And the state is actually allowing a sustained level of homelessness while also allowing a sustained level of totally wrong use of housing. Waterford Council, another example, 1,050 examples of one person living in a 2- and 3-bed house. That's totally wrong. And this conversation we're having, therefore, is false because we're not even looking at how to manage what we have correctly. We're just throwing more money.
OK, that's an interesting point.
It is an interesting point, and certainly we need to manage what we have correctly. But if you look at another figure that was in the budget today, 146 million on emergency accommodation. So not only are we not putting the money into where it needs to be, we're also continuing to reap the problems that are by too much focus on the market. So I do think Karl is pointing out that there's one measure there, reutilisation, the stock that's there.
Homelessness.
There are also other.
That's massive.
There would not be enough there in the real world, Karl. In the real world, you're speaking there like you're part of a monoculture yourself, where you're not open or you're not listening to other kinds of solutions that might be available.
There's the numbers.
I'm not going to look at those numbers now, Karl.
You're not interested.
But the reality is, what I've cited to you is evidence from a lot of other countries that don't have the housing problem that we have because they believed in the state and the capacity of the state to actually be a large provider of housing. And that's the macro point I'm making. You can get into micro numbers there, but the overall point is, in other countries, the state carries about 40% of public housing across a very wide variety of people. And I think that's the real point to be made about the housing crisis today. It's not just a problem of social housing. It's not just a problem of homelessness. The march that was on last Wednesday was full of young people, working people, students across generations.
I do want to bring Karl back in.
Yeah.
You know, there is certainly there's an argument that you've made there, which is a very interesting one. But it is also a fact that the state got out of the business of building houses, and we've ended up with a crisis.
This is not an argument. This is the argument. The argument is that we can fix homelessness tomorrow if we use what we have now correctly. Now, if you want to talk about spending billions elsewhere and just ignore the obvious fix, which is standing there in front of everyone, that's up to you.
Well, Karl, if the obvious fix that you're saying is that we need to look again at state-based solutions to public housing and to resolving the housing problem, I'm with you. You've named one area where we could look, but the very obvious other area is the use of public land that we have at the moment to build public houses.
I just want to ask
that's the bigger fix that we need to be talking about.
I just want to ask Karl a quick question. How are you going to get those people out of their homes? Because that's effectively what you're talking about.
Well, if we had a famine and someone sat down every night with 3 meals for the state and they ate one of them and threw out the other 2, I wouldn't be long in saying, hold on, I want those other 2 meals for the starving people. So if we've got a housing famine, we've got to have a conversation with the people who are in those houses. Is that acceptable to anyone? Can we ever talk about the important things in this world?
Karl, some of what you're talking about has been tried in other countries. Okay, the bedroom tax is the obvious example where similar type of structural problems were identified and solutions arose. And they weren't as simple as you're suggesting they were. They caused a lot of social dislocation and a lot of problems, and they particularly impacted on some groups more than others. So whilst you're identifying maybe some structural issues in housing policy that certainly can be looked at, they are not fix-all solutions that you're identifying that you can sweep away a whole housing crisis with one policy solution.
The biggest social housing development in Dublin so far this year wasn't delivered by the state. It was the Ivy Trust. They did it on state land that was allowed to go derelict. If you're trusting the state to fix this, just look at how they manage their affairs. Now, the one thing I would say is there's a land development agency. They've got pipelines of 10,000 homes coming down the line. This problem will fix. It won't be fast. But if we're not going to have a serious conversation about how we use the things we already have prudently and to use it so it's sustainable, then we're just missing the point.
The biggest thing we already have is public land, and how we're using that public land is the thing.
I'm afraid we are out of time, but Mary Murphy, Karl Deeter, thank you both very much for joining us. Miriam.
Minister?
Well, the state